Hello and good day. This is the Bible Bard. A bard is a storyteller who recites traditional texts that are associated with a particular oral tradition in the past. I'm here to recite and to amplify what the literature of the Bible says about who is God and who are human beings. Here's the lesson, and here's the place we're at today. Critics of the Bible contend that Bible passages seem to condone, regulate, or fail to explicitly condemn the practice of slavery. The idea critics promote is that if the God of the Bible is so good, why didn't he 5,000 years ago condemn the human practice of slavery? Or at least, once Jesus arrives, why didn't he condemn it 2,500 years ago? The Bible Bard is interested in what the Bible actually says about issues, but before I list the Bible verses that detail the biblical content and the author's attitudes toward slavery, let's first look at slavery itself as an institution. The very first thing we note is that there is such a thing as voluntary slavery. In ancient times, individuals who found themselves on the edge of life or death could sell themselves into slavery, thereby escaping poverty, debt, or starvation. In the Mosaic Law, if a Hebrew did this, the law of God required such slaves to be released after serving 6 years. See Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 through 18. Then we can see, after America was founded, the poor who wanted to escape Europe could enter into an indentured servitude by signing a slavery contract, binding them to years of labor in exchange for their passage to the New World. Also, in societies with no bankruptcy system, creditors seized debtors and or family members as slaves when the debtor defaulted on their debt. This goes back a long way. See the Code of Hammurabi from Babylonia. This practice is pervasive, still continues today in various countries. Then, of course, there's involuntary slavery. And this is common in most ancient and pre-modern societies where defeated armies and civilian populations were captured and enslaved as spoils of war. You can see the history of Egypt, Babylonia, Syria, China, and Rome if you need facts. Chattel slavery is a form of slavery that we're most familiar with. We understand it as absolute slavery, where people are treated as property and enslaved for life. In some cases, people could buy their way to freedom, as was the case of Odilei Equiano, you can see his book. After raiding an area in the British Isles, the Vikings often enslaved people. Some of those people were learned folks and monks and such, and they sold them in Europe and Russia as teachers, personal assistants, and household servants. In the New World, in Aztec and Incan societies, tributary slaves were required from the subject nations they controlled. Then, of course, there's penal slavery, where instead of being executed or beaten, convicted criminals could be enslaved and escape immediate death. There's also the class of slave soldiers. This happens mostly in the Islamic world and in Africa. For example, the Mamelukes in Egypt and the Ottoman Janissaries made soldiers out of slaves. Then, of course, there's sexual slavery, which is concubinage. And this is practiced in many ancient societies, and it's permitted in Islam. In Quran 424, female war captives were allowed to be used as sex concubines. In the ancient world, about 10,000 BC to 1000 AD, slavery was technology. If you needed air conditioning, a slave waved a palm frond over your head. If you needed your house heated, a slave gathered wood and made a fire. If you needed water, a slave went to carry it from a well or a river. Pyramids were built using slave labor. Canals were dug. Slaves in mines searched for gold. These are just a few obvious examples of the use of slave labor as technology. The Bible describes the basis for slavery coming from human nature. In a terrific verse, Galatians 5:19, it states, quote, "The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like," end quote. Slavery is a mode of human dominance of other humans. It's not a spiritual mode of the God of the Bible. During this age in which we live, human beings can oppose God. They can curse God. They can reject and defy the God of the Bible to his face. And during their lives, they often appear not to be judged or punished by God. They can live as this verse I just quoted from Galatians 5:19 describes. During the age to come, this freedom that human beings use now to gratify their evil desires to be different from God as they wish, that is going to end. Here's what the Bible actually says about slavery. Let's look at this in the discussion section. The Bible Bard, of course, is interested in what the Bible actually says, not what critics say it says. So from the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, written some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, depending on the text, we have the following verses about slavery. In Exodus 21:16, the verse says, quote, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Comment: the gateway to slavery, kidnapping, is condemned in the Bible. This is 3,500 plus years ago in the Mosaic Law. Of course, this is God's law to the Hebrew nation, and the surrounding countries and people, world empires, didn't recognize this law, and they still don't today. In Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39 to 43, the text says, quote, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. Because the Israelites are my servants," God is speaking, "whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly." Comment: this law from Leviticus only applies to Hebrews, among other Hebrews. The next verse, verses 44 to 46, we find these verses following this one about not accepting Israelites as slaves. Here, the next verses accept the institute of slavery as practiced in other nations. Non-Jews could be purchased as chattel slaves by Jews. Even here, this recognition is not an advocacy. Instead, it's a recognition that slavery is or was an aspect of human society, and it's not going away. See the next section I've provided where I make additional comment about these verses that are positive about slavery in the context of the Hebrew nation. The next verse is from Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16, and it says, quote, "If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Do not oppress them." End quote. Comment: protection for runaway slaves is required under the law of Moses. That's very interesting. In the next verse, Isaiah 58:6, we have some metaphors. It says, quote, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen?" And then the Bible text provides what this separate kind of fasting, rather than going without food, is. It says, quote, "To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke." Quote. Now, what is that about? Comment: in ancient societies, enslaved laborers and oxen were controlled using a yoke. So this breaking every yoke is or was a call to believers to oppose enslavement, which occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries in the West, and slavery in the East, of course, continued until the 20th century. The moral force behind the anti-slavery movement was Christian and based upon the biblical text. This force succeeded in part in that chattel slavery is outlawed today in most nations. The source of this social movement against slavery arose mostly from a Christian interpretation of the biblical text. However, because of the hardness of the human heart, bonded labor, debt slavery, and human trafficking still continue to this day. Now let's talk a little more about this special passage in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, that states actually, quote, "Your male and female slaves," he's speaking to the Jews, "are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living with you or among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property." You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Comment, there's no doubt that these 3 verses allow chattel slavery in ancient Israel. But because the Bible Bard deals with the Bible as literature, what can we say about this exceptional text, which actually seems to fit the critics' idea, which they apply to the whole Bible and God, not just here. This allowance is part of the law of Moses given exclusively to the nation of Israel alone. This law was evidence of their special chosen relationship to God among the nations. Therefore, this content does not apply to any non-Jews or to any Jews who are not living in the land of promise. This text also is not advocacy. The text is an allowance or a concession. As literature, we find that Jesus talked about another concession made in the law. In Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 9, the enemies of Jesus came to him with a question about another contentious issue: divorce. They asked him, quote, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" End quote. This question was a trap to get Jesus to contradict the law. The Pharisees already knew Jesus was against divorce, but Jesus gave an answer that not only held to his strict position against divorce, but also upheld the law. He said in Mark 10, verse 5, quote, "It was because of your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law." End quote. In other words, according to Jesus, an allowance was made in the law for marital incompatibility that allowed a certificate of divorce to be written and the divorced wife to be sent away. This was a concession, Jesus says, made because of human nature and culture and not because this was a marital solution, divorce, that God approved of or advocated for. The Bible Bard now makes the same argument for this text on slavery. The ancient Israelites could engage in chattel slavery under this legal exception. Only non-Israelites could be enslaved. Does this make the God of the Bible culpable for the advocacy of slavery? I think not. Because of the use of the institution of slavery throughout human society and history, because slavery was the technology of ancient times, this text allows slavery to be practiced in the ancient Hebrew society under conditions and with restrictions that make it apparent this is an exception only allowed because of the hardness of the human heart and not because a moral God was promoting this human failing. The concession is God hated divorce and God hated slavery, but addressed human nature with his ancient people through these exceptions. Now let's look at what the New Testament, the Greek scriptures, written 2,500 to 2,000 years ago, have to say about slavery. In Matthew 7, verse 12, the text says, quote, "Do unto others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up all the law and the prophets." End quote. Jesus is speaking, and early in his ministry, Jesus gives his initial rule for social living, a rule that is incompatible with slavery. We go to Matthew 22:39, and the text says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Again, Jesus is speaking late in his ministry, and Jesus provides spiritual direction for living that's also incompatible with slavery. See Mark 12, verse 31 for additional comment. Then in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, the text says, quote, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." End quote. Comment. Within Christianity, one's social position within humanity is void. Regardless of your human status, the followers of Christ are to recognize these human distinctions are to be discarded before God. Christians are to consider all people as equal to themselves before God, regardless of their human social position. Now in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, it says, quote, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery," quote, "to sin." Comment: this verse compares Christian life to the life of non-Christians, extolling the freedom before God that comes from following Christ to the slavery or the sinfulness of life when living as described above in the verse in Galatians I just read. Once again, the yoke of slavery as a metaphor found in Isaiah 58:6 is enjoined. The difference between Isaiah and Galatians is 650 years, and this is remarkable literary consistency where the Old and New Testaments both use the same metaphor to deplore the yoke of slavery. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 1, the text says, quote, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." Comment: this remark harkens back to the command of Jesus to treat others as you want to be treated, but recognizes that in the society of that day, slavery is common. But Paul the writer adds a motivation for a specific slave and a specific master. Philemon is that master. God has control, Paul says, over the lives of believers, even as, metaphorically, a slave master has control over his subjects. This is motivation to treat your slaves right. In 1 Timothy 1, verse 9 and 10, the text says, quote, "We also know that the law is not made for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their father and mothers, for murderers," and the text goes on, "for slave traders and liars." Slave traders are condemned along with those murderers and liars. Comment: in Paul's biblical list of despicable human activities, he lists slave traders. In Philemon, chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, the text says, quote, "Perhaps the reason he, Onesimus, a runaway slave of the slaveholder Philemon, perhaps he was separated from you for a little while. It was done so that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as a dear brother." This was written 1960 plus years ago during the widespread slavery of the Roman world. And this is a book of the Bible, a whole book, which is focused on a slave Onesimus who runs away from his Christian master and goes for protection to the religious teacher of that master, Paul the Apostle. The Jew Paul harbors him, which is according to the law of Moses that we read to you earlier. But when Onesimus the slave becomes a Christian, Paul advises him to return and submit to his master Philemon. But he sends a letter instructing Philemon to treat Onesimus as a Christian brother and not as a slave. Once again, while Christians are living in a world of human social status, they're instructed to ignore that status when dealing with a fellow believer. That sounds a little bit like the Jews being told not to enslave other Jews. Summary: slavery is as common to human society as water is to fish. Someone immersed in this institution needs God's revelation to reject this evil human situation. As shown above in those verses, ancient biblical writers wrote out of a milieu that included daily observations of real slavery and biblical negative comments, prohibitions, or restrictions about slavery. So they saw this water of slavery like a fish. When we get to America, 1775 to 1870, slavery abolitionists, many of whom were Christians, used many of these biblical texts to encourage other citizens to promote the abolition of slavery in the USA. The deliberate attempts by critics and anti-religionists to disregard both the clear message of the biblical text and anti-slavery efforts led by Christians are truly reprehensible. Both in the law of Moses, the Old Testament, and in the words of Jesus, New Testament, and in the writings of Paul, slavery is shown to be incompatible with the desire and nature of God. The Bible is literature that describes who God is and who human beings are and condemns slavery even 5,000 years ago, when the general policy throughout human history was to practice enslavement in all of the ways I detailed at the beginning of this podcast. Conclusion: this is the way the Bible Bard works. Brief recitations, Closely focused, no distractions, no rabbit trails. The Bible Bard presents what the Bible teaches about a topic. I'm not trying to convert you to a religion. The Bible Bard podcast is informational. We're talking about what the literature of the Bible actually states, the ideas and concepts it presents, because most people have never engaged with biblical thought. Make up your own mind whether you agree or disagree with the Bible's pronouncements. You can support the Bible Bard podcast on Patreon with as little as $1 a week or $5 a month. That'll help cover the costs of this podcast. The Bible Bard himself takes no salary, nor does he financially benefit from the gifts of supporters to the ministry. Send the Bible Bard any question or remarks you care to offer to BibleBardUS@gmail.com. Glad to hear from you. In Connections, if you download the transcripts, you'll see many platforms where the podcast is hosted. There are links there so that you can go and hear the podcast on the platform you enjoy. Until next time, this is the Bible Bard.